Hi everyone, I'm Rosie Campbell. I'm a program lead at the Partnership on AI, leading our work on publication norms for responsible AI. Today, I'm going to give you a bit of an overview about the project, so looking at the goals, the team, the motivation, that kind of thing. Then I'll talk about the activities we've been doing so far. Then I'm going to talk about some key considerations, which are things that we've either learnt going through this project process or things that we are still interested in answering, open questions, and if you have any thoughts about those, we'd love for you to let us know. And then finally, I will talk about some of our current and upcoming work going on, and especially how you can engage in this work going forward into 2021. So starting with an overview. The motivation behind this project really stems from the idea that as we develop increasingly capable systems, how we thoughtfully disseminate this research and deploy our technology is an important part of responsible AI. And really, it's about the fact that we need to anticipate the impacts of our work and mitigate the risks so that we can all enjoy the benefits of the technology. To give a little bit of history and context around the project, in February 2019, OpenAI made the decision to adopt a staged release approach for their advanced language model GPT-2. And they did this because they had some concerns that the model might be misused, people might use it maliciously, or maybe there would just be unintended consequences. And so they decided to release a smaller version of the model initially, and then see how things worked, whether some of their fears came to pass or not. And then as they became more confident that the risks weren't happening, they could release larger versions of the model. And this prompted a really big discussion in the machine learning community. Some people were really pleased that OpenAI were taking this step towards adopting alternative deployment or publication norms. But other people thought that it was potentially going to erode the norms of openness in science, and they thought that the risks of messing with that status quo outweighed the potential benefits that you might get from being more cautious about the technology that you release. So this led to a discussion at a working group meeting that was for the Social and Societal Influences Group, expert group at PAI. So I was there as a partner at that point. I was contributing as a representative of the Centre for Human Compatible AI, and we were discussing a number of different case studies that could illustrate why publication norms might be useful as we develop different AI systems. And then when I joined PAI in July of 2019, I was able to take on that project and lead it, and it became more of an official PAI project. Later that year, we consulted with Salesforce about one of their pieces of research. They also had an advanced language model that they wanted to publish, but like OpenAI, they were a little bit concerned about the potential risks or impacts of releasing that work to the public. And so they came to us and we worked with them a little bit on the kinds of things you might want to think through and ask yourself before publishing a piece of research like that. And the kind of questions that we had to offer them actually came out of a series of partner meetings that we'd been having through the project, where we'd been talking about the different considerations that we might want researchers or product teams to ask themselves before releasing a certain type of technology. After that, we also contributed some expertise towards Facebook's deepfake detection challenge. This was a challenge aimed at encouraging people to create deepfake detection tools so that we could identify synthetic media and people wouldn't get duped in that way. The problem was that if you have a great tool for detecting synthetic media and that's publicly available, then it's possible that people who want to generate synthetic media are able to use that detection tool to actually train their models so that they can outperform the detection tool. And they were worried that if they put online or open sourced a lot of the submissions to this competition, then we could be in a situation where we're actually helping out people who are trying to manipulate media and create misinformation. So we were able to contribute some ideas on different ways of allowing access to the submitted entries to potentially mitigate some of those risks. In February of 2020, NeurIPS, which is a major machine learning conference, actually changed their submission requirements so that all authors of papers had to include a broader impact statement as part of their submission. This was a pretty big change in norms for the community. It's not something that we'd ever really had to think about before. And again, it caused quite a lot of mixed reactions. Some people were really pleased that we were, as a community, taking steps towards more ethical oversight of our research, whereas other people just thought that this could be an extra box-ticking exercise for researchers who might not be really well equipped to judge the broader impacts of their work. So again, we're seeing increasing conversation in the AI community around these issues of publication norms. In March of 2020, PAI launched our web resource on publication norms, which I'll talk a little bit more I'll talk about a little bit more later in the talk. But basically, it was a collection of all the thinking that we had done with our partner project meetings, as well as some resources that we had, such as the questions that we think might be useful for anticipating risks when thinking about publication decisions. So that's still online. It also includes a link to fill out a survey if you want to give us your thoughts. So I encourage you to take a look at that. Earlier this year, we received some funding from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation, which was awesome, and that has allowed us to hire a research fellow to really dive more deeply into some of these issues and really kind of push the project forward. So that's been great. Over the summer in 2020, we've been running a series of community workshops. This has been in collaboration often with members of our partner organizations. And really, this is about engaging a broad spectrum of the AI community on these issues, and I'll talk about why that's important in a minute. And then earlier this year, also, we put together a submission for a NeurIPS workshop on navigating the broader impacts of AI research, and we found out recently that was accepted, which is great. So for the next few months, we're definitely going to be focusing on trying to make that as good as it can be, and there's definitely opportunities for you to contribute to that workshop if you're interested. And then most recently, we had our research fellow start, who is Jasmine Wang, and she is now working on this project with me as well, and I'll talk about her work too. So currently the team is primarily me as a program lead and Jasmine as our postgraduate research fellow, but we've also had a lot of input from the Publication Norms project group, as well as a lot of support from other PAI staff. In terms of target audiences for this work, I see it as two main groups. So on one hand, we have the practitioners. So they're the people who are working with AI and machine learning technology on a daily basis, such as researchers, engineers, product managers, etc. And these are people who have the power to really affect widespread cultural change. If researchers and engineers adopt new practices or new norms, that's the kind of thing that is likely to ripple out throughout the community. And the downside of that, though, is the change can be somewhat slow. It's a very organic grassroots process, and so it might take a while for big step changes to be seen. And that's where the other target audience comes in. And I call these gatekeepers, but what I really mean by that is people who are at either end of the research pipeline. So either the people who are funding the research, the grant makers, or the people who have some control over what research gets published. So conference chairs, journal editors, and that kind of thing. And this group has the power to affect pretty instant changes by making policy decisions. So the NeurIPS broader impact statement is a great example of that. Making that decision has really caused a widespread effect in the community to adopt new standards. And so that happens a lot more quickly. The downside to that is I think if we implement top-down policy changes without also working with the practitioners, then you risk implementing policies that are not actually practical or feasible for the people working with the technology on the daily basis, and it kind of causes whiplash as things change too quickly. So really we want to target both of these groups, the practitioners who can do the more grassroots cultural change and the gatekeepers who have the power to affect more instant policy changes. We have three main goals for the work at the moment. The first is to normalize the consideration of publication practices as a lever in mitigating the risks of AI research. This is important because I think a lot of researchers that I encounter still feel of the opinion that it's not their role to anticipate the impacts of their work. And I think there are some very legitimate reasons for this. They are an expert in their own very narrow technical domain, and so it is quite a lot to ask that they think more broadly about the potential second and third order effects of their work. And often they see themselves as having the responsibility to just push the boundaries of scientific progress without actually thinking too much about the potential harms or negative consequences of that. So given that attitude is still pretty common, what we want to do is at least start the conversation about how publication practices might need to change, or where the different responsibilities lie. Is this something that should be on the researchers' side of things? Should this be an infrastructure solution throughout the whole community? So really this is just about making it more mainstream to talk about the risks of your work and thinking about publication practices as a lever in mitigating them. The second goal for the work is to illuminate pain points and coordination challenges of key community actors regarding responsible publication. And I'll talk a bit more about this later in the talk. But essentially, we have realized that even if individual organizations want to change their practices for the better, it's often quite difficult to do if they don't have the full support or coordination with other aspects of the research ecosystem or the community. So we really want to understand more about where these pain points arise and where the coordination challenges are occurring, and then what PAI could potentially do to help solve them. And then the final goal is to equip the community to effectively anticipate research risks with tools and information. So as I mentioned, researchers might not be in a great position to judge like the historical, political, social consequences of their work, and we think there may be tools that we can provide that will help them do that more effectively, whether that's frameworks, taxonomies, checklists, or even access to a panel of experts from other fields to help them think things through. We want to be able to provide those resources. And of course, throughout this whole work, we want to include a wide variety of perspectives and stakeholders, particularly leveraging the PAI network. This topic can be a fairly, people have strong feelings about it, I think, in one way or another. And so it's really important to us to make sure that we understand the full spectrum of opinions there and really try and come up with solutions that work for the community as a whole. So now moving on to talk about some of the activities we've done so far. They've mostly fallen into one of these four categories, either events, or research and resources, or consultations, or planning and resourcing. And by that I mean like the sort of meta level activities that you need to do to keep the project running. So starting with events, we have either hosted or co-hosted a variety of workshops. So early in 2019, after the GPT-2 decision, we hosted a discussion with OpenAI and other relevant people about this issue as it was just emerging. We did some user testing with CHAI, the Centre for Human Compatible AI, looking at the questions that we came up with to help researchers anticipate risk and figure out whether they were useful or not. Earlier this year, we held some socials at ICLR. The title was Anticipating Risky Research. So the idea was how we can go about as a research community anticipating potentially risky research impacts. We also hosted a couple of workshops with the Montreal AI Ethics Institute, and they've just published their report, which writes up some of the conversations we've had. So please take a look at that if you're interested. And then we also collaborated with the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford. They had produced a guide to how to write a broader impact statement for the new NeurIPS requirement, which was aimed at helping researchers write that effectively and engage substantially with the topic. And so we hosted a workshop with them, which was a chance for researchers who were struggling with it or who wanted some pointers to actually come and work through that guide and create their broader impact statement. We've also been involved with events going on elsewhere, either as speakers or participants, including the Foresight Institute's BBC Biosecurity Summit and a reading group at MIT. We've been also producing some research and resources. So this is our web resource, which is at partnershiponai.org/publication-norms. Here we talk about some of the thinking we've done in terms of the trade-offs, the interventions, and their limitations when it comes to changing publication norms. We also include some preliminary research we did looking at other fields, analogies from other high-stakes fields like cybersecurity, biosecurity, that kind of thing, as well as historical analogies. We list on this page our open challenges and opportunities for further work. And we also include some resources like our risk assessment process for researchers and a taxonomy of alternative release strategies, which not only includes things like the staged release approach that we saw with GPT-2, but also ways to potentially release only to a limited audience or only release certain artifacts of your work, that kind of thing. And we also include a way for people to submit their thoughts on this topic so that we can incorporate this wide variety of perspectives. Thirdly, we've been doing different kinds of consultations. So I already mentioned the expert group workshop with the social and societal influences group at PAI. We've been having monthly partner project meetings, and we've also been advising partners and related projects. So I mentioned Salesforce, Facebook. We've also been working with the AI media team at PAI on a taxonomy of adversaries project. And we've been providing feedback to other people, other partners who have been doing research in a related area and contributing thoughts there. And then finally, we've been planning and resourcing the project work. And as I mentioned, we've been very fortunate to receive funding from the Alpha Peace Loan Foundation. And we also have just completed our round of recruitment for a research fellow. Okay, so now diving into some key considerations of this work. First one is this trade-off between openness and caution. And normally I don't really like to put these things as opposed to each other, but I think it can just be useful to get a sense of what we're talking about, to think about it in this way. And the question here is about how do we retain the benefits of open science while also being cautious about what we release into the world? Clearly science, open data, open sourcing has had huge benefits to intellectual progress, and we really don't want to inadvertently hamper that. So how do we retain those benefits while also just being a bit more cautious and thinking about the potential impacts of the technology we're putting out into the world? We're also interested in understanding the potential pitfalls of changing the status quo of publication norms. Obviously, part of this work is being very cautious about potential impacts you can have, and so we're trying to apply that to ourselves as well. So thinking about, what could go wrong, what are the impacts or the risks of actually changing the status quo as it is at the moment. We are also interested in the responsibility, where we assign responsibility to these issues, whether that's a collective responsibility or an individual responsibility. And I found this tweet really interesting. So this was in response to a question about the broader impact statement requirement for NeurIPS papers. And somebody said that they had stopped doing computer vision research because they saw the impact their work was having. So here, an individual researcher has actually, taken a step, taken it on themselves to make that decision. And so I think it's an interesting question to think about to what extent we expect individual researchers to be taking steps like that versus whether this is something that is more of a collective problem for the community at large, whether we need to create certain infrastructure or services or norms to change things on a more systemic level. And, likely it's a little bit of both, but I think where we position ourselves on that spectrum currently is a pretty unresolved issue. People have a lot of different opinions about that. Another thing we're keen to think about is effective implementation of any interventions that we go ahead with. I think there's a risk that the interventions could end up not really being that meaningful. They could just be dismissed as a box-ticking exercise, so we really don't want that to happen. And relatedly, we don't want to just add unnecessary red tape to the research publication process. For example, if we advocated an internal review process before publishing work, how do we make sure that that's as lightweight as possible while also achieving the goal that it's setting out to do? And then finally, there's a question of to what extent we should be focused on research publication norms in the sort of more academic style foundational research community versus product deployment, where these technologies are either being developed into a consumer product or they are or a model or something that users can interact with is being released along with the research itself. So that I think, there's different opinions on which of those interventions is a higher priority. We're also interested in thinking about how our current norms and potentially new norms would interact with adversaries. So one question is, under what circumstances does publishing research help harm mitigation researchers more than it helps malicious actors? We often hear the saying sunlight is the best disinfectant, and so actually some people are of the opinion that it's actually safer to publish everything as openly as possible, because it can then help the people who are researching harm mitigation methods. But I think this is somewhat of an empirical question to understand to what extent it tends to help those people versus actually giving a leg up to malicious actors. And there's been some interesting research coming out of FHI on this topic. And we're also concerned about things like, will publishing risks in broader impact statements just give bad guys ideas? So is there a chance that if in all of our AI papers going forward, we list all the possible ways you could use that technology for harm, could that just end up causing more issues because it makes it much easier for people to understand how to use technology to cause problems? We're also interested in coordination. So I mentioned this earlier, that this has been a challenge, and I wanted to just highlight 3 sort of imaginary scenarios where we could see the lack of coordination on publication norms becoming an issue. The first one is, let's say a research team identifies risks with publishing their training data, but then their paper is rejected from a conference due to an open data policy. So here, a research team is sort of taking some experimental steps to mitigate some risks, but because that is out of sync with the norms in the conference or other parts of the community, they are then being penalised for taking those steps because they're not able to publish. So we really need to understand how to sort of sync up on those sorts of practical issues. Another example is a research team receiving funding for a project, but midway through, maybe they notice significant risks to publishing some aspects of the work. But if the funding was contingent on all aspects of the work being openly published, that puts them in a difficult situation because they'll feel pressured to publishing it anyway, despite their concerns, or they might have to go back to the funder and renegotiate, but that could be complicated. And then finally, we could see, and I think we already see this to a certain extent, companies competing for research talent and therefore feeling pressured to avoid implementing unpopular oversight mechanisms. So if it does seem to be the case that one particular intervention, like an internal review board, is a positive step towards mitigating risks, companies still might not want to implement things like that because they know they're all competing for the best talent, and if the researchers are not bought into these ideas, or they don't want to have the unnecessary extra overhead, then that could push things towards like a less good equilibrium. Okay, and so now on to some current and upcoming work. As I mentioned, we are holding a workshop in December, on December 12th at Neurips 2020. The title is Navigating the Broader Impacts of AI Research. I have some fantastic co-organisers here: Carolyn Ashurst from Future of Humanity Institute, Solon Barakis from Microsoft and Cornell, Deb Raji of Mozilla, and Stuart Russell of the Centre for Human Compatible AI at UC Berkeley. And we currently have our call for papers live, which I encourage you to go and take a look at on the website listed here. We're interested in a range of topics covering mechanisms of ethical oversight in AI research, challenges of AI research practice and responsible publication, collective and individual responsibility in AI research, and anticipated risks and known harms of AI research. So if you have thoughts on any of those topics, please do consider submitting a paper. And as part of this, we're also hoping to award a handful of prizes for great examples of broader impact statements. The idea here is, because this is a new thing for researchers to be doing, it might be, it's probably quite a difficult thing to ask them to do. And by highlighting some really great examples of people who've engaged substantially with the topic and they've written out their impact statements the impact statements they've come up with have been well written. We want to highlight those so that future authors that are considering submitting and also are required to submit an impact statement have something to refer to, a kind of benchmark or at least some examples that they can be inspired by. So we'll be organising a prize as part of this workshop. Another large stream of work for us at the moment is looking at case studies from other fields or from history. So I won't have time to go into details for all of these now, but just to give you a sense, one field we're looking at is bioengineering. They've had some very interesting types of changes to their publication norms to accommodate different potential risks. Cybersecurity, which has things like a norm of coordinated disclosure. Human rights, which deals with some really interesting trade-offs when it comes to the issue of open publication, or not publication, but open putting out things in public versus like keeping things private. So I think there's some interesting analogies there to that we could learn from. Nuclear security obviously is a very high stakes field, and actually some examples within nuclear security arguably illustrate the dangers of too much secrecy. I think some people attribute Chernobyl to there being not enough openness and transparency in the work there, so that kind of gives a couple of different perspectives. And then finally, national security obviously has some norms that are used there where they trade off public right to know with their own foreign policy objectives too. So we're doing research on a variety of fields here, looking at case studies where we can draw analogies. And we're also hoping to run a webinar series where we interview experts from these fields to really get a sense about what it's like to be a researcher in a field with these different norms. So just zooming out a little bit now, I've been talking a lot about publication norms and focusing on specifically the research community, which is that's definitely been the primary focus of our work in this area so far. But we actually are starting to hear from our partners that perhaps responsible deployment of technology itself is a more pressing issue. And obviously these two things are related, but we are thinking about now refocusing a little bit more on actually product deployment, model deployment, and how to do that in a responsible way rather than the fundamental research itself. And I actually see this as a part of safety engineering in general. So we've talked about other high stakes fields, but I think there are generally a lot of engineering fields that incorporate safety mechanisms, oversight mechanisms that aren't currently present in AI and machine learning. So we think there's an interesting opportunity there to apply safety engineering principles to AI. And ultimately, we see this as, if we really kind of zoom out a bit further, this is could be considered part of safety critical AI. So safety critical AI is a area that has been historically of interest to PAI. We've had a safety critical AI working group for a long time who've been working on a variety of projects. And I think this work has a lot of overlaps there, which we're going to be exploring more going forwards. So some examples of safety critical AI work where we see there's been some overlap here. Firstly, we're interested in historical safety lessons from high stakes industries. So I mentioned this already in terms of publication norms, but we want to expand that to look more generally at safety practices, responsible deployment and other practices in other fields that we can learn from and potentially apply to AI. A second possible work stream is on industry coordination on responsible deployment. So as I mentioned, this is becoming more of a priority for our partners, and particularly we're hearing some appetite for thinking about this with respect to natural language processing, so these advanced language models that we're seeing. So we're thinking about trying to do some more proactive coordination between organizations that are working on these models so that we can get to a point where, or to at least try to solve some of the technical and policy challenges around ensuring that these models are capable and we can retain the benefits of them, while also potentially stopping them being able to produce toxic output or other undesirable side effects. So how we can mitigate some of the harms or the negative aspects of those models while also enjoying the benefits, I think has both technical and policy challenges associated with it. So we want to do some coordination there with groups working on that subject. And then finally, we're interested in multi-agent safety in critical domains. My colleague Carol Wainwright has been taking the lead on our technical AI safety work at PAI. And you might have seen his spotlight talk already, but we are thinking about opportunities for collaboration here on potentially issues like cyber physical systems such as autonomous vehicles, or critical infrastructure such as healthcare or finance, energy, that kind of thing. So how we can, again, apply these engineering safety lessons from other fields to these critical domains that are increasingly incorporating aspects of AI and machine learning. So yeah, it would be great if you are interested in any of these particular domains to let us know so we can factor that into our prioritization. So now some concrete ways to engage in this work. Right now, we have a few opportunities. Please consider submitting to our NeurIPS workshop if you have a paper in mind that could work. We'll also be sourcing people to review papers, so I may be reaching out to some of you to ask if you would be interested in reviewing papers for our workshop. We'll also be looking for judges for the Broader Impact Statement Prize, so again, I may be reaching out to some of you to help with that. I'd also love to hear if you're building advanced language models so that we can incorporate your work into this industry coordination aspect. And generally, if you have challenges in responsible deployment, either as it relates to publication norms or something else, we would love to know about it so we can incorporate that into our planning. And of course, telling us what safety critical domains are a priority for you and your organization. It's likely that we won't be able to take on a whole variety of safety critical domains, so we'll probably focus in on just one or two initially. So we want to make sure that we're choosing a domain that is of high priority to our partner organizations. In terms of ongoing ways to contribute, we always appreciate connections to key partners, stakeholders, and experts. As I have said many times, I really do want to incorporate a wide variety of perspectives here. So if there's anyone who has strong feelings about this issue or just has been thinking about it for a while, I'd love to get in touch with them. As we continue to publish our work, I'm expecting we'll be publishing blog posts and papers in the upcoming months. We'd really appreciate your feedback on those, as well as any resources that we produce, such as frameworks for thinking about risk. We are always very happy when our partners promote and attend our workshops and events. So again, keep an eye out for those, and especially if you're attending NeurIPS, please do join us for our workshop there. And generally just telling us your priorities helps us scope our work going forward into 2021. Some very immediate things you can do. We will be having a town hall discussion as part of the PAI All Partner meeting, and that's happening on October 7th at 1 p.m. So please join for a discussion on some of this work there. And you can also join our monthly project calls. If you're a partner and you're not already in this group, please do email me and I can add you to the mailing list, and you can join for our lively partner calls that we have to plan this work out. I want to say a big thank you to all of our partners, especially those who have been really engaged with this project and coming to our meetings, providing feedback and all of the work that's happened there. I also want to thank the Sloan Foundation again for the funding that has really enabled us to do a lot of this work. And of course, all of my PAI colleagues who have supported me throughout this process. Thank you very much. I look forward to talking to you more about this work at the Town Hall.